The banner said CONGRATULAT as Sarah in gold foil letters, and underneath it, on a folding table that still had my handwriting on the underside from the last inventory count, sat a sheet cake with her name piped across it in blue icing. I was standing by the industrial press I had rebuilt with my own hands 11 years ago, wearing safety glasses I'd bought myself because the company never restocked them in my size, and I was watching my father hand the keys to Meyers printing and bindery to my younger sister in front of every single employee on the shop floor. 34 years old, 16 years of 6 a.m. openings, jammed feeders, client calls at midnight, and a father who called me the reliable one, the way you describe a good forklift. And his explanation, the whole of it, the entire justification for signing over a business I had bled for, was one sentence. She's just better with people. Nobody clapped louder than my sister. Nobody looked away faster than me. I want to tell you what happened after that cake was cut, because it wasn't the ending anyone in that room expected. It wasn't even the ending I expected, and I was the one who walked out the door. My name is Buffy Meyers, and before I tell you about the day I lost the company, I need you to understand what that company actually was, because on paper it sounds like ink and paper and machines. It wasn't. It was my grandfather's hands. Elias Meyers started Meyers Printing in 1968 in a rented storefront in Danvers, Ohio, with a single flatbed press, and a sign he painted himself on a sheet of plywood, hand-lettered, deep green with gold trim, MEYERS Printing in letters that leaned slightly to the right because his hand had, too, after 40 years of setting type. That sign hung above the door for as long as I was alive. I used to trace the brushstrokes with my finger when I was small enough to be carried in on my father's hip. My grandfather didn't believe in shortcuts. He believed a print run was only as good as the person who checked it twice, and he believed that the person who checked it twice should be someone who cared whether the client's wedding invitations arrived crooked. He taught my father the business the same way his own father had taught him, not through manuals, but by standing at your shoulder until your hands knew the machine better than your mind did. He taught me the same way. I was the only grandchild who wanted to learn. My sister Sarah is 4 years younger than me, and from the time she could talk, she had a gift I never had. She could walk into any room and make everyone in it feel like the most important person there. She could charm a supplier out of a late fee. She could turn an angry client into a repeat customer with nothing but a phone call and a laugh. And my father worshipped that gift the way some men worship a firstborn son. I don't say that with bitterness. I say it because it's the truest fact I know about my family, and everything that happened later grew out of that one root. I was the one who liked the machines. I liked the smell of solvent and the particular silence of a shop floor at 6 in the morning before anyone else arrived, when the presses were still cold and the only sound was my own footsteps on concrete. My grandfather used to say I had print in my blood, and he meant it as the highest compliment he had. I took a part-time job at the shop the summer I turned 18, meant to be temporary, meant to fund a semester somewhere else. I never left. I told myself I was staying because the business needed me. The truth, which took me a long time to admit, was that I was staying because it was the only place I had ever felt necessary. My grandfather died when I was 26. He left the building itself, the physical real estate, separate from the company, in a trust that named me as the eventual owner, with my father holding it as trustee until what the paperwork called an appropriate transition of leadership. At the time, none of us thought much about what that phrase meant. My father told me it was a formality because you're the one who'll still be here. I believed him. I had no reason not to. For the next 16 years, I was, in every functional sense, the operations of that company. I renegotiated our paper contracts 3 times to keep us solvent through the years when digital printing gutted half our competitors. I was the one who drove out at 11 at night when the binding machine jammed on a rush order for a hospital system's annual report, because losing that client would have cost us 40% of our commercial revenue. I trained every apprentice who came through those doors. I knew every client's name, every client's kid's name, every client's pet peeve about kerning. My father handled the front office and the handshakes. Sarah, for most of those years, was somewhere else entirely, 2 failed business ventures of her own, a marketing job in Columbus, a stretch of time nobody in the family discussed in detail. She came back 4 years before the banner and the cake. If you've ever built something with your hands only to watch someone else take the credit for it, tell me in the comments. I read every single one. Sarah came back to Danvers the spring I turned 30, and my father acted like the sun had risen a second time that day. She didn't come back to run a press. She came back with a laptop, a folder of marketing decks, and a phrase she used constantly in those first months: modernizing the brand. I want to be fair to her, because this story only means anything if I'm honest about every person in it, including myself. Sarah wasn't lazy. She worked long hours on the things she was good at: the website redesign, the Instagram account, the client lunches. She was genuinely better with people than I was. I have never once denied that. What she was not good at, and what she never seemed to notice she wasn't good at, was the actual mechanics of keeping a print shop alive. She didn't know that our Heidelberg press needed its rollers replaced every 18 months or the ink would smear on glossy stock. She didn't know that our biggest client, a regional grocery chain, required a 48-hour rush turnaround on their weekly circulars, and that missing that window even once meant losing the account entirely. She knew none of the things that kept the lights on. She knew how to make the lights look good in a photograph. My father started introducing her differently at industry events. "This is my daughter, Sarah. She's bringing us into the 21st century. When he introduced me, which happened less and less, it was always some version of, "and Buffy keeps everything running." Keeps everything running, like I was a furnace. I noticed the shift in small ways before I understood what it meant. Meetings that used to include me started happening without me. "Just a quick coffee with Sarah," my father would say. "Nothing operational, don't worry about it." Client contracts that I had spent months negotiating started getting Sarah's name added as a secondary signatory. "For continuity," my father explained, "in case something ever happens to me." I told myself that was reasonable. I told myself a lot of things were reasonable. The company's 20-year lease on the building, the physical structure my grandfather had built the business inside of, came up for renewal that same year. Because of the trust arrangement, my father, as trustee, was the one who signed the renewal, not me, even though I was the one who would eventually own the property outright. I asked him about the trust once, directly, over coffee in his office. I asked him when the appropriate transition my grandfather's paperwork mentioned was supposed to happen. He looked at me for a long moment before he answered. "When I decide the business is ready for it," he said. "There's more to running this place than knowing the machines, Buff." I didn't push. That's the part I still sit with some nights. I didn't push because pushing felt disloyal, and because some small, quiet part of me, the part that had spent 16 years being told I was reliable instead of being told I was loved, was afraid of what I'd learn if I asked too many questions. Sarah's rebrand launched 18 months before the banner. New logo, new tagline, Meyers, printing reimagined, new website with stock photography of presses that didn't resemble any machine we actually owned. My father called it a triumph. Our actual production numbers, which I tracked every week in a spreadsheet nobody else looked at, told a different story. Client retention had dipped 4%. 2 of our oldest accounts my grandfather had personally serviced, had quietly moved a portion of their orders to a competitor 2 towns over, citing communication issues that I recognized from the emails I still handled. As missed deadlines nobody had told me about until the client was already gone. I raised it once in a family meeting, spreadsheet in hand. My father waved it off. "Growing pains," he said. "You can't build the future looking at last quarter's numbers." Sarah didn't even look at the spreadsheet. She looked at me, and there was something in her expression I couldn't name yet, not quite guilt, not quite pity. I understand it now. It was the look of someone who already knew something I didn't. 6 months before the banner, I noticed my father and Sarah having lunch together every Thursday. Not unusual on its own. They'd always been close in a way, Sarah, and I had never quite managed to be with each other. But these lunches had a texture to them. They came back from each one a little quieter, a little more careful about what they said around me. Once, I walked into my father's office to drop off a signed invoice and found a manila folder on his desk with my name. My full legal name, Elizabeth Meyers, which nobody had called me since my grandfather's funeral, typed on the tab. My father closed the folder before I could see what was inside and asked, a little too brightly, if I'd finished the Hendricks proof. I asked our longtime bookkeeper, Dottie, who had worked at Meyers Printing since before I was born, if she knew anything about it. Dottie had a way of answering questions without answering them. "Your father's been meeting with Ronald Kepler," she said, not looking up from her ledger. Ronald Kepler was our family's estate attorney, the same man who had handled my grandfather's trust. "That's all I know, sweetheart. That's all I'm going to say." I told myself it was nothing. Estate lawyers handle 100 kinds of paperwork. I had a rush job for a hospital system due that week and a broken feeder motor to deal with, and I let the folder go, the way I'd let so many things go, because there was always a fire in front of me more urgent than the smoke behind me. Looking back, I think that was the moment the story actually turned. Not the banner, not the cake, but that folder closing on my father's desk, 6 months before anyone told me anything at all. I just didn't know it yet. None of us ever know the turn while we're still inside it. My father started asking me, gently, thoughtfully, whether I'd ever considered taking some time, whether I'd thought about what I wanted outside the business. I remember one conversation in particular, late on a Friday, the shop empty except for the two of us. He said, "You've given this place everything, Buff. Don't you ever want a life that isn't standing at a press?" I remember thinking it was one of the kindest things he'd said to me in years. I didn't understand then that kindness can be the softest possible way of clearing a path. Sarah, meanwhile, had started sitting in on client calls that used to be mine. Not taking them over exactly, just sitting in. "To learn the relationships," she said. I trained her, actually, on 3 of our biggest accounts, walked her through every quirk and preference those clients had, because she asked me to, and because some old, stubborn part of me still wanted to believe we were a team. I taught her how to keep the Hendricks account happy. I taught her the names of the assistants' kids at the hospital system. I handed her, piece by piece, without knowing it, everything she would need to survive without me. Have you ever realized, only in hindsight, that you were being quietly written out of your own story? Drop a comment. I want to know how you found out and what you did next. The email went out on a Tuesday. All staff meeting, Thursday morning, mandatory, exciting news about the future of Meyers Printing. I remember reading it standing at my workstation, still in my safety glasses, ink under my fingernails from a job I'd finished at midnight the night before. I remember a specific, physical feeling, not quite dread, more like the pressure drop before a storm, the kind your body registers before your mind admits anything is wrong. I didn't sleep much those 2 nights. I told myself it was probably an equipment announcement, a new client win, something ordinary. I told myself that because the alternative was a thought I wasn't ready to hold. Thursday morning, the shop floor had been cleared of its usual clutter. Someone, Sarah, I found out later, with 2 temp workers she'd hired for the day, had strung the banner between the ceiling beams above the collating table. C108ULATUNS Sarah, gold foil, 6 feet across. The cake sat on a folding table with a blue and white tablecloth I'd never seen before, sheet cake, her name piped in icing, a small fondant printing press on top as decoration. Every employee was there, all 23 of them, people whose kids' names I knew, people I'd trained myself, standing in a loose semicircle around the table with the particular stillness of people who already suspect what's coming and don't know where to look. My father stood at the front, in the good blazer he wore for client dinners, not shop clothes. Sarah stood beside him, and Ronald Kepler, the estate attorney, stood a step behind them both, holding a leather folder against his chest like a shield. My father cleared his throat and thanked everyone for their hard work over the years. He talked, briefly, about my grandfather, about legacy, about the next chapter. And then he said the sentence that ended 16 years in one breath. Effective today, I'm formally transferring controlling ownership and operational leadership of Meyers Printing to Sarah. There was a pause, the kind of pause where a room decides, collectively and silently, whether to clap. Someone started, uncertainly, and then more people joined, because that is what people do in rooms, they follow the first sound. I stood by the Heidelberg press, the one I had rebuilt with my own hands 11 years earlier, and I watched my coworkers applaud my sister for receiving what I had spent my adult life building. My father found me afterward, near the ink storage, away from the cake. He put a hand on my shoulder, the way he used to when I was small, and he said the sentence I will hear for the rest of my life. I asked him why. I asked him, calmly, quietly, why after 16 years after everything it was Sarah and not me. And he looked at me, not unkindly. That's the part that still catches in my throat. He didn't look cruel. He looked almost relieved, like a man setting down something heavy, and he said, "She's just better with people, Buff. You know that. This business needs someone who can be its face. You've always been better at the machines." He said it like a compliment. I think, in his mind, it was one. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I have never once in my whole life made a scene, and I wasn't going to start in front of 23 employees and a sheet cake with my sister's name on it. I took off my safety glasses, set them on the workbench where I'd left 100 pairs before, and I asked Ronald Kepler, in a voice that came out steadier than I felt, for a copy of whatever paperwork he was holding against his chest. He looked at my father. My father nodded once, like giving permission for something. Kepler handed me the folder. I didn't open it there. I walked out through the loading dock, past the dumpster where, I would learn 3 weeks later, someone had thrown away my grandfather's hand-painted sign to make room for Sarah's new illuminated plastic one. Deep green, gold trim, MEYERS printing, leaning slightly to the right, propped against the metal bin like garbage. And I got in my car, and I drove home, and I sat in my driveway for 40 minutes before I could make myself go inside. I didn't know it yet, sitting in that driveway with an unopened folder on the passenger seat, but everything my father had just handed away. The thing he thought was the whole of the company was never actually his to give in the way he believed it was. My grandfather had made sure of that, 16 years earlier, in language none of us had ever bothered to fully read. I would read it that night, and it would change everything. I sat at my kitchen table that night with the folder Ronald Kepler had handed me, a cup of coffee going cold beside it, and I read my grandfather's trust for the first time in my life, word for word, instead of trusting my father's summary of it. It took me 2 hours and 3 phone calls to a friend from college who'd gone into real estate law before I understood what I was actually looking at. The trust my grandfather had set up 16 years earlier didn't just say the building would eventually come to me. It said something far more specific, in the dry, careful language lawyers use when they don't trust the people around the table to behave well after they're gone. The building and the land beneath it, the physical structure my grandfather had built with his own hands in 1968, were held in trust for me, Elizabeth Buffy Meyers, with my father as trustee only until one of 2 conditions was met, either my 35th birthday or my father's voluntary written resignation as trustee, whichever came first. On that date, ownership of the real property would transfer to me outright, automatically, with no further action required from anyone. My father hadn't resigned, but my 35th birthday was 6 weeks away. My father, in his rush to hand the company to Sarah, in 18 months of lunches and folders and quiet meetings with Kepler, had apparently never once gone back and reread the actual terms of his own father's trust. He remembered the spirit of it. Buffy gets the building eventually, but not the mechanism. He didn't know, or had let himself forget, that in 6 weeks, the ground beneath Meyers printing would belong to me regardless of who was running the company inside it. There was one more detail, smaller, that Kepler had flagged in a note clipped to the front of the folder. The kind of note a careful, ethical lawyer leaves when he suspects a client is about to make a mistake he can't openly discourage. A lease renewal my father had signed 18 months earlier, the one giving the company continued use of the building, had listed my father as sole authorized signatory on behalf of the trust. But the trust document required any lease longer than 1 year to carry my signature as well, once I'd turned 30, which I had, 4 years before that renewal was signed. My father's signature alone wasn't enough. He either hadn't known that or hadn't wanted to know it. I want to be careful here, because this is the part of the story where it would be easy to make my father into a villain, and he wasn't one. He was a man who loved his daughters in 2 different, unequal ways and never fully reckoned with the gap between them. He didn't forge anything. He didn't set out to steal from me. But Ronald Kepler, when I called him the next morning, was very clear on one point. The lease renewal, lacking my required signature, was not valid. Which meant that in 6 weeks, when the building became legally and fully mine, Meyers Printing, now Sarah's company, would have no valid lease to operate inside it at all. I sat with that for a long time. I want you to understand that my first instinct wasn't triumph. It was grief. This wasn't a stranger's building. It was my grandfather's plywood sign, my father's whole life, the floor I'd learned to walk on in some family photograph nobody could find anymore. I didn't want to burn it down. I wanted, more than anything, for someone in that family to finally see me. But wanting to be seen and being handed the truth are two different things. And once I had the truth in my hands, I understood I had a choice to make about what kind of person I was going to be with it. I didn't go to Kepler's office to demand anything. I went home first, and I called my father, and I asked him to come to my house. Not the shop, not his office, my kitchen table, the one my grandfather had actually built for me as a housewarming gift 12 years earlier, out of the same walnut he used for his own dining set. He came alone. I'd asked him to, and I think some part of him already sensed why. I laid out the trust document, page by page, the way my grandfather had taught me to lay out a print job before running it, every element checked, nothing left to guesswork. I showed him the transfer date. I showed him the co-signature requirement on the lease. I watched something in his face shift as he read his own father's handwriting in the margins. Notes Elias Meyers had made decades earlier, in pencil. Things like, B has the eye for detail. Protect the building for her regardless of what happens with S. My grandfather had seen something in me at 18 that my father had spent 16 years failing to see at all. My father put his head in his hands at that kitchen table, and for a long time neither of us said anything. When he finally spoke, he didn't argue with the paperwork. He asked me what I was going to do. I told him the truth, which was that I hadn't decided yet, but that whatever I decided, I wasn't going to do it the way it had been done to me, in a room full of employees, with a banner and a cake and no warning. I told him I'd give him and Sarah 30 days to prepare, whatever I chose. I spent those 30 days doing the only thing I have ever really known how to do well. I worked. I met with Ronald Kepler 3 more times to understand my options cleanly, without emotion clouding the paperwork. I drove past the shop late one night, not to go in, just to look, and that's when I saw it, propped against the dumpster in the loading dock in the rain. My grandfather's original sign, the plywood one, deep green and gold, the letters leaning slightly to the right. Sarah's rebrand had replaced it with a backlit plastic version weeks earlier, and nobody had thought to do anything with the old one except throw it away. I got out of my car in the rain and I carried that sign to my trunk myself. It weighed more than I expected. Some things do. The confrontation, when it came, wasn't loud. I want to be honest about that, because I know some of you are waiting for the moment where I finally raise my voice, where 16 years of being underestimated comes pouring out across a table. That's not what happened, and I've made peace with the fact that it isn't what happened, because I think the quiet version was stronger. 30 days after that first kitchen table conversation, my father asked me to come to the shop, not for another all-staff meeting, just the 3 of us, in his office, after hours. Sarah was there when I arrived, arms crossed, already defensive in a way that told me my father had explained the situation to her days earlier, and she'd had time to build a wall around it. "You're doing this to punish me," she said, before I'd even sat down, "because Dad picked me." I told her, as calmly as I could, that this had nothing to do with punishment and everything to do with paperwork that existed before either of us was old enough to understand it. I told her I wasn't taking the company from her. The company, the client relationships, the equipment, the name on the new plastic sign, all of that legally belonged to her now, exactly as my father had transferred it. I had no interest in undoing that, even if I could have found a way to. What I told her instead was that the building the company operated inside of was mine, fully and legally, as of 3 days earlier. My 35th birthday had come and gone quietly. No cake, no banner, just a certified letter from Kepler's office confirming the transfer had completed automatically, exactly as my grandfather had written it 16 years before either of us knew we'd need it. I offered her a lease. A real one, market rate, with proper terms, the same kind any landlord would offer any tenant, nothing punitive. Nothing designed to force her out, but nothing discounted either, because I was done discounting myself in that family. I told her I'd give her 60 days to review it with her own attorney before signing. She didn't take the lease. I want to tell you she did, that this story ends with her signing the paper and everyone learning to get along inside the same four walls. But that isn't what happened, and I promised you the truth at the start of this. Sarah, furious, convinced that I was somehow outmaneuvering her out of spite, rather than following a document that predated our entire conflict, told my father she'd rather relocate the company than pay her sister rent to run Dad's business. My father, caught for the first time in his life squarely between the two daughters he'd never learned to love equally, didn't defend me and didn't quite defend her either. He just went quiet, the way he always did when a decision required him to actually choose. Sarah moved Meyers printing to a leased commercial unit across town 4 months later. She took the equipment, the client contracts, the new plastic sign. She left behind an empty building that had been my grandfather's whole life's work, standing quiet under a bare patch of wall where the old wooden sign used to hang. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and finally standing up for what was actually yours, tell me which one you chose and whether you'd choose it again. I didn't sit in that empty building and mourn it for long. Grief needs a season, but it doesn't get to run the whole calendar, and I had spent too many years of my life waiting for someone else to hand me permission to start something. I reopened Meyers Printing, the original name, the original building. The trust technically still allowed me the name since it had never been formally severed from the real property in the transfer paperwork, a detail Kepler confirmed with something close to satisfaction. Under my own ownership, with my own crew, 6 weeks after Sarah's company moved out. I hung my grandfather's original sign back above the door myself, on a ladder, in the cold, alone, and I stood on the sidewalk afterward and looked at it the way I used to look at it as a child on my father's hip. Deep green, gold trim, letters leaning slightly to the right. I called the clients myself, not to poach them from Sarah. I want to be clear about that, because I'd promised myself in that first quiet drive home that I would never build anything on the wreckage of someone else's failure. I called the clients who had already left on their own, the 2 accounts that had quietly drifted away during Sarah's rebrand, the ones who told me, almost sheepishly, that they'd been meaning to reach out but didn't know if I was still in the business. I told them the truth. I was starting over, smaller, slower, but with the same standards my grandfather had built the whole company on in 1968. Word moves differently in a small town than people expect. It doesn't move loud. It moves through the people who actually notice quality, the wedding planner who remembers whose invitations never smudged, the hospital administrator who remembers who answered the phone at 11 at night when the run was late. Within 4 months, I had more clients than I could comfortably staff. Within 8 months, I hired back 3 employees who had quietly left Sarah's company on their own, citing missed deadlines and a shop floor that no longer felt like it knew what it was doing. Sarah's business, meanwhile, struggled under the weight of a commercial lease that cost more than the market rate one she'd refused from me, in a location with less foot traffic, and none of the institutional trust my grandfather had spent 40 years building at the original address. I heard about it the way you hear about most things in a family that's gone quiet with each other, secondhand, through my mother, in careful, neutral language. Sarah's having a hard stretch. The new place isn't finding its footing the way she hoped. I didn't feel triumphant when I heard it. I want to be honest about that too. I felt something closer to sadness, the specific kind you feel watching someone you love struggle with a weight you tried to warn them about, and they wouldn't set down. It took just under 2 years for my father to walk back through the door of the building his own father built. He came on a Tuesday morning, before we opened, the way he used to when I was small, and he'd bring me in early to watch him check the press rollers. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before he said anything, looking at the old sign above the entrance, back where it belonged. And then he looked at me, in my safety glasses, ink under my fingernails, exactly the way I'd looked the day he gave everything away. He didn't apologize with a speech. My father was never a man of speeches. He apologized the way he'd always shown love, in small, practical gestures. He asked if I needed help with the books that quarter, since Dottie had finally, gently retired. He asked, carefully, whether I'd consider quoting a job for an old family friend who'd specifically requested the real Meyers shop, the original one. He said the word original like it cost him something to say. Sarah and I never fully repaired what broke that day in front of the banner and the cake, and I've made peace with the fact that some things don't get fully repaired, only carried differently. Her business, after a difficult 2 years, found a smaller, more honest footing under a new name of her own choosing, doing marketing and design work rather than production. The part of the business she'd always actually been good at. Without the machines, she'd never learned to love the way I did. We speak now, at holidays, carefully, the way two people speak when they've decided the relationship is worth more than the argument that almost ended it. She sent me a card on the 2nd anniversary of the original sign going back up. It said, simply, I should have signed the lease. I keep it in the drawer of my grandfather's walnut desk. My father comes by most Fridays now. He doesn't run anything. He isn't the trustee of anything anymore. He just stands near the Heidelberg press, the one I rebuilt with my own hands, and watches me work the way he used to watch his own father work. And I think, in his own late and imperfect way, he finally sees what I always was to that company. Not the reliable one, as though reliability were a consolation prize. The one who actually built it. People ask me sometimes whether I regret how quiet I was all those years, whether I wish I'd fought harder, sooner, louder, before it ever got to a banner and a cake and a sentence that ended 16 years of my life. I've thought about that question more than almost any other. Here's what I've come to believe. My grandfather didn't protect me with dramatic gestures. He protected me in pencil, in the margins of a trust document, 16 years before I ever needed it, because he understood something about quiet work that the rest of my family took decades to learn. The people who make the least noise are very often the ones actually holding everything up. He didn't leave me a company. Companies can be handed away in a single sentence, in front of a cake, by someone who never really understood what he was giving up. He left me a building, and a sign, and the simple, stubborn insistence that the truth, properly documented and patiently waited for, doesn't need to shout to eventually be heard. I think about that sign a lot, how it ended up in a dumpster in the rain, discarded for something shinier, and how it's hanging exactly where it always belonged now, weathered and leaning slightly to the right, because that's how my grandfather's hand always leaned, and some things are worth keeping exactly as imperfect as the person who made them. If you've made it this far, I hope you'll do one thing for me. Wherever you are, whatever quiet work you're doing that nobody's clapping for yet, the spreadsheet nobody reads, the machine only you know how to fix, the 11 o'clock phone call only you're willing to make, I hope you know that it counts. It counts even when nobody hands you a banner for it, sometimes especially then. Thank you for listening to my story. If it meant something to you, I'd be grateful if you'd like this video, subscribe for more stories like it, and tell me in the comments about the quiet work you've done that finally got seen. I read every single one. I'll see you in the next story.